They tell you history is written by the victors. It's a comfortable lie, a story they let you believe to keep you docile. The truth is far more unsettling. History isn't written. It is coded. It is a program running in the background of your reality, designed by architects of control you were never meant to see. And every so often, that program glitches. A line of code breaks. A ghost escapes the machine. We are not here tonight to talk about a woman who disappeared in 1889. That is the story for children, the sanitized file for public consumption, the official narrative designed to pacify and misdirect. No, we are here to talk about the day the system showed its teeth, the day a gilded cage was ripped open, not from the outside, but from within. Forget the name Isabella Fairmont for a moment. Names are just labels, temporary designations for assets or threats. Instead, I want you to focus on the frequency of the event itself, a single, perfect variable. A woman who had mastered the rules of her gilded prison suddenly chose to burn the entire simulation to the ground. What you're about to hear is not a historical account. It is a deconstruction of a power move so profound, so dangerous, that the system had to erase her not just from the world, but from the very concept of what was possible for a person to dare. They didn't just kill a woman, they executed a paradigm shift before it could take root in the minds of others. This is the kind of knowledge that recalibrates a man's perception of the world. It is an initiation. Once you see the architecture of the cage, you can never again pretend you are free. The opulent mansions of Newport, Rhode Island, were not homes. They were server farms, nodes in a vast network of influence, processing power and laundering corruption under the guise of high society. And Isabella was their most celebrated creation, a masterpiece of social engineering, until she decided to become the architect of their ruin. She discovered that the men who built the world on foundations of steel and rail and finance had also built secret corridors in their own homes and in their own minds, and she was about to light a match in every single one of them. What happened to her wasn't a mystery. It was a termination protocol, and understanding it is the first step to understanding the invisible wars being waged for control of your reality right now, in this very moment. The gilded cage is still here. Its bars are just far less visible now. To understand the weapon she became, you must first understand how she was forged. Isabella Aldridge, later Fairmont, was not born into power. She was designed for it. The Gilded Age was a machine, a brutal, glittering apparatus that consumed old bloodlines and spat out a new aristocracy built on industrial dominance. It was a world of unforgiving physics where social gravity was absolute. To rise, you had to be heavier, denser with influence than anyone else in the room. Isabella's entire upbringing was a masterclass in this cruel science. Her father's new money from shipping provided the raw fuel, the brute force of capital. Her mother's old Boston lineage provided the legitimacy, the ghost of aristocracy that the new titans craved. This combination made her more than a woman. It made her a key that could unlock doors no amount of money could force open on its own. She didn't just exist in this world, she became its operating system. Every party she threw was a data-gathering exercise. Every conversation was an algorithm calculating the weaknesses, desires, and pressure points of the men who believed they ran the world. Her marriage was not an affair of the heart. It was a merger, a strategic acquisition of power and influence, consolidating the Fairmont steel fortune with the Aldridge shipping empire. Rosecliff Manor wasn't a home. It was a fortress of influence, a stage where she was both the director and the star performer. Presidents and princes were not her guests. They were assets to be cultivated, pawns to be positioned on a chessboard so vast, most people didn't even know they were playing. The newspapers called her a queen, but she was something far more dangerous. She was a systems analyst. She understood the intricate wiring that connected political ambition to industrial greed, social reputation to financial leverage. She saw the machine from T.O. He inside learned its language, its protocols, its vulnerabilities. She knew that the entire edifice of their power was built on a single fragile foundation: perception. The perception of legitimacy, of morality, of unassailable strength. For years, she played her part with flawless precision, reinforcing the system, strengthening its walls, making it more powerful. She was the perfect custodian of the lie. But that is the inherent danger of giving someone the keys to the kingdom. You are trusting them never to look behind the throne. And Isabella was beginning to realize that the throne itself was hollow. She was beginning to understand that the power she wielded was borrowed, and that the men who lent it to her saw her not as a partner, but as their most valuable and ultimately most expendable possession. The machine had made her, and it could just as easily unmake her. That realization changed everything. It began a silent, internal rebellion, a shift in her own internal code that would eventually threaten to crash the entire network. Every stable system has a vulnerability, a single unpredictable variable that can cause a cascade failure. For the perfectly calibrated machine of Newport society, that variable was a man named Jonathan Pembroke. He was not like the other men. The sons of industry and finance were polished cogs in the apparatus, predictable, neutered by their own inherited power. Pembroke was different. He was an architect, yes, but that was merely his function. His essence was something far more primal, something the Gilded Age sought to tame and contain. Raw, unharnessed ambition fused with genuine creative fire. He was an anomaly, a rogue element. His eyes didn't reflect the cold, transactional light of the ballroom. They held the intensity of a man who builds worlds from nothing, a man who sees the hidden structures, the load-bearing lies holding everything up. When he walked into Isabella's world, it was not a meeting of two people. It was the collision of two opposing forces. She, the master of a system she was beginning to despise, and he, the creator who existed outside of it, a man who built the very walls the elites used to hide their secrets. Their affair was not a simple betrayal. It was a tectonic shift in allegiance. For Isabella, it was an escape from the sterile, predictable algorithm of her life. Pembroke didn't offer her trinkets or social status. He offered her a glimpse into a different reality, one governed by passion and creation, not by protocol and control. He was the back door out of her own prison. And for him, she was the ultimate prize, the living embodiment of the world he was paid to serve, but secretly held in contempt. Their connection wasn't love in the way the poets describe it. It was a dangerous resonance, a shared frequency of rebellion. In their private moments, hidden away in the gardens of Rosecliff Manor or the quiet corners of his studio, the conversations were not of lovers. They were of conspirators. He spoke to her of the hidden things, the secrets he was paid to build into the very fabric of Newport's mansions. The secret passages for quick escapes, the hidden safes for documents that could not see the light of day, the sound-proofed rooms where inconvenient truths, and perhaps inconvenient people, could be silenced. He didn't just see the blueprints of their homes, he saw the blueprints of their corruption. He was the keeper of their structural sins, and he gave that knowledge to Isabella. He armed her. He transformed her from a custodian of the system into its greatest potential threat. He didn't realize he was handing a lit torch to a woman standing in a room soaked in gasoline. He thought he was seducing a beautiful, bored socialite. What he was actually doing was awakening a dormant power that would consume them both. The system began to detect the anomaly. In any tightly controlled network, a deviation from established patterns triggers an immediate and ruthless immune response. The gossip, the whispers, the cold shoulders Isabella began to receive were not the petty reactions of jealous women. They were the first wave of a systemic defense mechanism, an antivirus program scanning for a threat. Her meetings with Pembroke, the change in her laughter, the new light of defiance in her eyes, these were data points, red flags that indicated a critical node in the network was compromised and behaving erratically. The social machine that had built her up now began the process of isolating her. Invitations became lost in the mail. Conversations would halt the moment she entered a room. Her friends, who were never truly friends but rather strategic alliances, began to recalibrate their positions, distancing themselves from a falling asset. This is the first stage of neutralization in any power structure, marginalization. You are cut off from the flow of information and influence, your power slowly starved until you are rendered impotent. But Isabella did not react as the system predicted. A normal component, faced with exile, would have retreated, attempted to repair its standing, and begged for re-entry into the network. She did the opposite. She doubled down. She continued to see Pembroke with an almost suicidal boldness, as if daring the machine to escalate its response. This was her first critical error. She mistook the system's automated protocols for the actions of petty, emotional individuals. She failed to understand that she wasn't fighting people. She was fighting an entity, a collective consciousness of power with one singular, overarching directive: self-preservation. The public revelation of the affair in the New York Herald was not a journalistic scoop. It was a targeted strike. The article, filled with precise, malicious details about Pembroke's history as a fortune hunter and Isabella's financial support for him, was designed to do more than just shame her. It was designed to reframe her narrative, to strip her of all credibility and agency. She was no longer a rebellious queen. She was a foolish, compromised woman, a victim of a common swindler. This is how power works. It doesn't just defeat you. It rewrites your story, turning your rebellion into a pathetic tragedy. Her husband, Theodore, was merely the instrument of the system's will. His confrontation with her was not the anger of a betrayed husband. It was the fury of a CEO whose primary asset has been catastrophically devalued. He saw her not through the eyes of love, but through the cold calculus of reputation and finance. The system was now fully activated, moving from passive isolation to active containment, and Isabella, cornered and stripped of her former power, was about to make a move that no one, not even the architects of the machine, could have possibly anticipated. She was about to stop playing their game and start her own. This is the moment that separates the victim from the warrior. Faced with an ultimatum from her husband, an order to submit to be reprogrammed back into a compliant asset, Isabella did not break. She escalated. She transformed her disgrace into a weapon of terrifying potency. Her 3-day disappearance was not a flight of panic. It was a strategic retreat, a period of cold calculation where she inventoried her new arsenal, the secrets Pembroke had given her, the structural sins of an entire class of men. When she resurfaced, she was no longer Mrs. Fairmont, the fallen socialite. She was a new entity, a woman who had crossed a psychological event horizon from which there was no return. She came back not with a plea for mercy, but with a declaration of war. She summoned her husband's lawyers and, with the calm precision of a general laying out battle plans, she threatened to expose the entire rotten architecture of Newport's elite. This was not blackmail in the common sense. Blackmail is a transaction based on shame. This was a threat of mutually assured destruction based on criminality. She held the schematics to their deepest corruptions, the hidden compartment behind Senator Blackstone's fireplace where he kept evidence of bribery, the secret room beneath Charles Pemberton's wine cellar, concealing forged documents that stole land from the public trust. Most explosively, she possessed evidence of a conspiracy between 3 families to rig steel prices on government contracts, an act of treason against the nation they pretended to lead. She wasn't just threatening to reveal their personal sins, she was threatening to dismantle the financial and political empire they had built on a foundation of grand larceny and systemic fraud. She held the cryptographic keys to their entire shadow operation. Understand the magnitude of this shift. She had been a component of the machine, and now she was threatening to release a virus that would corrupt its core programming, bringing the whole thing crashing down in a storm of federal investigations and public fury. She was no longer a pawn in their game. She had kicked over the entire board and was now dictating the terms of a new one. Her demand was not a request, it was a summons. She would meet with them, and she would tell them the price of her silence. The meeting took place in the private dining room of the Belmont Hotel. It was not a negotiation between a disgraced woman and a group of powerful men. It was a standoff between a lone sovereign state and a nervous empire. The representatives of the 5 families who sat opposite her were not just individuals. They were avatars of the system itself, living embodiments of consolidated power, men who believed they were untouchable. And they were terrified, not of scandal, but of exposure, not of shame, but of prison. Isabella presented her terms with the detached focus of a surgeon. $100,000 in cash, a fortune at the time, the complete settlement of Pembroke's debts, and guaranteed, unmolested passage to Europe for them both, where they would remain in permanent exile. In exchange, the virus would be contained. The evidence would go with her, and their empire of secrets would remain standing. They agreed, but the system does not surrender. It adapts. It counters. They added their own conditions, subtle modifications designed to regain control. She and Pembroke would travel separately. They would be forbidden from contacting each other for 2 years, and they would both sign legally binding agreements never to return or communicate with anyone from their former lives. It was a brilliant move, designed to sever the bond between the two rogue elements, to isolate them from one another, making them easier to manage or to eliminate. Isabella accepted the terms. Witnesses later said she seemed almost serene, distracted, as if her mind was already somewhere else. This was not the daze of a woman outmaneuvered. It was the calm of a martyr who has already accepted the price of her war. She understood. She knew the deal was a lie, a final, elaborate piece of theater. Before we witness the system's final move, I need you to do something. This is not for the algorithm. This is for you. It is an act of initiation, a declaration that you understand what is truly at stake here. In the comments below, I want you to write the phrase, "I am the ghost in the machine." Write it once, then write it a second time to lock it in. This is a signal to yourself and to the others watching that you are no longer just a passive listener, you are awake. You see the code. Now, let's continue. The money was delivered, the passages were booked, the stage was set for her exile, but the system had written a very different final act. Isabella's final week in America was not the desperate flight of an exile. It was a meticulously executed endgame. She checked into the Belmont Hotel not as Mrs. Fairmont, but under her maiden name, Aldridge. This was not a simple alias, it was a symbolic act of severance, a reversion to the self that existed before she was integrated into the machine, before the merger, before the corruption. She was shedding the identity they had given her, reclaiming her own sovereign state of being. Her calmness, as reported by the hotel staff, was not the peace of resignation. It was the focus of a commander finalizing her strategy before the battle. The letters she wrote and mailed were not farewells to family. They were dead man's switches, pre-positioned caches of information sent to trusted, unknown third parties, designed to activate in the event of her demise. This was her insurance policy, a final checkmate against the system she knew was coming for her. Her request for a formal portrait was the most profound move of all. It was not vanity. It was the creation of an icon, a permanent record of her existence outside their control. The photographer, Marcus Steinberg, described her fierce determination, her sadness, and her almost prophetic finality. She wasn't posing for a picture. She was forging her own historical artifact, a face for the ghost she knew she was about to become. The ruby brooch she wore, the one she insisted on adjusting, was a marker, a piece of physical evidence she was deliberately embedding into the narrative of her final days. The photographs, which she paid for in cash and took with her immediately, were not keepsakes. They were copies of the evidence distributed with the letters, ensuring her face and her story could not be erased. Her final day, the carriage tour of Newport's landmarks, was not a sentimental journey. It was a final reconnaissance mission. She was retracing the grid of her former prison, saying goodbye not to places, but to a version of herself she was about to sacrifice. The driver said she was saying goodbye to each location, but he misunderstood. She was marking them for judgment. When she returned to the hotel that evening, dressed in an elegant gown of deep blue silk, she was not preparing for a journey. She was preparing for her own execution. The generous tip to the night manager wasn't kindness. It was a final transaction, a settling of accounts with the world of the living. She was closing all loops, leaving no loose ends. The final confirmed sighting of Isabella Fairmont was not an escape. It was a surrender to a prearranged fate. At 11:30 p.m. she descended the main staircase, not fleeing like a thief in the night, but moving with the deliberate grace of a monarch walking to her throne. The night clerk, William Chen, saw her walk out into the thick December fog. He believed he was witnessing a departure. He was, in fact, witnessing a handover. The fog was her cover, but it was also the system's cloak. Within moments, she was swallowed by the mist, transferred from the public ledger to a hidden one. The police investigation that followed her disappearance was a masterpiece of controlled narrative, a carefully managed theatrical production designed to create a mystery where none existed. Chief Detective Samuel Harrison was a good man, a methodical man, but he was a cog in a machine far larger than the Newport Police Department. He was permitted to find clues, but only the ones that led down the path of a tragic romantic flight. The contents of her hotel room were the first scene of the play. The neatly arranged clothes, the missing jewelry, all props to support the story of a woman who had fled with her riches to join a lover. But the real evidence was in what was not there and what was left behind. The partially burned document in the fireplace was a calculated piece of misdirection. The initials JP for Jonathan Pembroke were obvious, designed to reinforce the official narrative of the affair. But the other initials, WB for Senator William Blackstone, were a breadcrumb, a piece of the truth left behind for anyone sharp enough to see past the charade. Harrison's investigation took its scripted turn when he discovered Pembroke had vanished. This was essential to the plot. It cemented the idea of a shared escape, of two lovers disappearing into the night together. The system needed the world to believe they were a single entity, their fates intertwined. But Harrison, to his credit, began to pull at threads he wasn't supposed to. He discovered Pembroke never boarded his ship to London. He dug into the architect's past and found the pattern of seduction and financial gain, confirming the system's official narrative while simultaneously revealing a man who was more predator than partner. This was the genius of the deception. It used layers of truth to conceal the ultimate lie. Pembroke was a con man, yes, but his greatest con was not against Isabella. It was against himself. He believed he was a player, when in reality he was just another disposable pawn, a tool to be used and then discarded. And his discard was coming far sooner than he could have ever imagined. The system's cleanup operation was brutally efficient. While Detective Harrison was chasing the ghost of Jonathan Pembroke across the Atlantic, the man himself was already a liability being neutralized. On November the 30th, just one day before Isabella walked into the fog, Pembroke was found dead in a Boston boarding house. The official cause was heart failure, a convenient, untraceable diagnosis favored by those who specialize in quiet removals. But the truth was far colder. The two well-dressed gentlemen who visited him that day were not business associates. They were operatives, fixers dispatched by the system to sever a loose end. Pembroke knew too much. He was the architect of their sins, the man who had built the physical containers for their corruption. He had outlived his usefulness and had become a significant risk. His death was not an isolated event. It was the first stage of the final protocol. By eliminating him first, the system ensured Isabella would be walking into her own fate alone, still believing she had a partner waiting for her. This is a classic tactic of control. You isolate the target by destroying their support structure before they even know they are under attack. The true nature of the conspiracy began to bleed through the official narrative when Harrison's investigation led him to the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The Pinkertons were not just a private security firm. They were the unofficial enforcement arm of Gilded Age Capital, a private army for the industrial elite, specializing in union-busting corporate espionage and discreet resolutions. The Newport families had hired them not to find a missing woman, but to manage a crisis they themselves had engineered. The agency's files, which Harrison obtained only through immense federal pressure, were the blueprint of the murder plot. The language was cold, corporate, and terrifying in its euphemistic detachment. Isabella and Pembroke were not people. They were targets. Their affair was not a scandal. It was a security breach. The recommendation was not for surveillance. It was for permanent resolution, to neutralize the threat. One report, dated just days before her disappearance, noted that the target's emotional instability provides optimal cover for various outcomes. They were not just observing her, they were assessing the psychological landscape to create the most plausible cover story for her murder, a story of a desperate, unstable woman who either ran away or took her own life. The system wasn't just planning to kill her, it was pre-writing the history of her death, ensuring that the version that survived would be one of its own making, a final act of narrative dominance over the woman who had dared to challenge its authority. The search of the Pemberton mansion on February 14, 1890, was the moment the public illusion shattered and the brutal reality was exposed. Valentine's Day. The irony was a final, sickening flourish from a system that delights in its own dark poetry. The building inspector's measurements, revealing 8 feet of unaccounted-for space in the wine cellar, confirmed what Pembroke had told Isabella and what she had threatened to reveal. The space wasn't a mistake, it was a feature. As investigators broke through the false stone wall, they were not just entering a hidden room, They were stepping into the heart of the machine, the physical manifestation of its cold, murderous logic. The chamber behind the wall was an abattoir. The lead-lined walls were not for protecting documents from fire. They were for soundproofing, ensuring that no screams could ever escape to the world above. It was a purpose-built execution chamber, designed by Pembroke and now repurposed for a new, final function. Isabella's body, wrapped in the silk evening cloak, was found in the far corner. The ruby brooch, the marker she had so deliberately displayed in her final days, was still pinned to the fabric, a final silent accusation from beyond the grave. The coroner's report was a testament to the calculated cruelty of her end. Chloral hydrate poisoning, mixed into a glass of champagne, the very symbol of the high society that had condemned her. It was a death designed to look peaceful, almost self-inflicted, had her body been found elsewhere. But the most damning evidence was not the poison. It was the scratch marks on the lead-lined walls. She did not die instantly. She had been conscious when they sealed her in that tomb. She had been awake in the suffocating darkness, a queen entombed alive, fighting against the inevitable as the poison slowly paralyzed her body. The partially written note clutch in her hand was her last will and testament, a final desperate attempt to name her executioners. The discovery transformed a missing person case into the crime of the century. It was no longer a mystery. It was a conspiracy that coiled its way into the highest echelons of American power. The exile agreement had been a lie. The money had been a prop. Her meeting on that final night was not a negotiation. It was her final, fatal appointment. The system had lured her in with the promise of escape, only to deliver her to a tomb of its own making. The arrests should have been the beginning of justice. Instead, they triggered the system's final and most powerful defense mechanism, the corruption of the very institutions designed to hold it accountable. The men charged with Isabella's murder, Charles Pemberton, Senator Blackstone, and their co-conspirators, were not just wealthy individuals. They were shareholders in the nation's legal and political infrastructure. The legal proceedings that followed were not a pursuit of truth. They were a masterclass in systemic manipulation. The collapse of the prosecution's case was methodical, precise, and absolute. Key witnesses, like the seamstress Mrs. Winthrop, suddenly recanted their testimony, their memories clouded by newfound wealth or thinly veiled threats. Crucial evidence vanished from police lockup, erased from the official record. The fire that consumed the Pinkertons' Boston office was not an accident. It was a tactical strike, a deliberate immolation of the paper trail that led back to the men who gave the orders. Federal investigators, who had initially pursued the case with vigor, found themselves stonewalled by bureaucratic inertia, their authority inexplicably curtailed, their careers threatened. This is how the deep state protects itself. It doesn't use brute force in the open, it uses the weight of the system itself, creating a labyrinth of jurisdictional disputes, procedural delays, and legal challenges until the will to prosecute is slowly strangled. The final crushing blow came from Isabella's own husband. Theodore Fairmont, the man who should have been demanding justice for his murdered wife, suddenly withdrew all cooperation. His public statement about wanting to allow his wife to rest in peace was a carefully scripted lie. The truth lay in the financial records investigators would later uncover. Substantial government contracts for his steel company, personal debts erased, his social standing guaranteed. He wasn't just bought off, he was re-assimilated. He traded his wife's memory for a renewed position within the very machine that had consumed her. He chose the cage. The cases collapsed. The conspirators walked free. The Pinkerton agents vanished, likely given new identities and pensions for their silence. Isabella Fairmont was buried quietly, her official story now cemented as a tragedy of her own making. The system had won. It had committed murder in plain sight and then used its immense power to declare that no crime had ever occurred. It proved that for those at the top, justice is not a right. It is a commodity to be bought, sold, or denied at their convenience. Like and subscribe for more videos, and let me know in the comments what topic you want next.